I thought justice would sound like a verdict, clean and final, something you could hold on to, but the night they said not guilty, it sounded like silence pressing against my chest until I couldn't breathe, the courtroom lights too bright, the air too cold, my fingers numb around the edge of the wooden bench as people started standing, talking, leaving like nothing had happened, like something in me hadn't just broken beyond repair. And I remember staring at him across the room, the man who had taken everything from me. Standing there adjusting his suit like this was just another inconvenience, another Tuesday afternoon. And no one stopped him. No one even looked twice, because money has a way of rewriting reality before anyone notices. And I whispered under my breath, barely a sound. I just wanted justice, but the words didn't travel. It didn't land anywhere. They just disappeared into the space between who I was before and whatever I was becoming. And when I stepped outside, the rain hit hard, cold drops, soaking through my coat in seconds, blurring the city lights into something distant and unreachable. I didn't have an umbrella, didn't have a plan. I just stood there on the courthouse steps while people rushed past me, heels clicking, engines humming, life moving on like mine hadn't just stopped. And that's when I noticed the car, black, parked too still at the curb, engine running low like it was waiting, not for anyone, but for something. And I told myself it meant nothing, just another expensive car in a city full of them, until the door opened and he stepped out, slow, deliberate, like time worked differently around him, tall, composed, his coat untouched by the rain, like even the weather knew better than to cross him. And he didn't ask if I was okay, didn't offer sympathy. His eyes just settled on me, steady, unreadable, like he was measuring something I couldn't see. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled, the kind that didn't need to be loud to be heard. Tell me what they did. And I remember blinking, confused, the question too direct, too personal, like he already knew the answer and was just waiting for me to confirm it. And something in me resisted, something stubborn and broken. So I shook my head and stepped back, rain dripping from my hair, my voice sharper than I expected. I don't need help, because I didn't, not from someone like him, not from a stranger who looked like he belonged to the kind of world that created people like the man who walked free today. And for a second, I thought he might argue, might step closer, might try to convince me, but he didn't. He just watched me, quiet, like I had already said everything he needed to hear. And then he nodded once, almost to himself, like a decision had been made, somewhere far beyond me. And he turned, walked back to the car, the door closing with a soft, final sound that echoed louder than anything in that courtroom. And I stood there long after he was gone, the rain still falling, my heart still racing, telling myself it didn't matter, that none of it mattered. But the next morning, when the headlines started changing, when names that had been untouchable suddenly weren't, when a system I had begged for justice from began to crack in ways no one could explain, I realized something I couldn't unthink, something that settled deep in my chest like a second heartbeat. I hadn't been ignored that night. I had been heard, just not by the law. I did not believe it at first, because things like that do not just happen overnight. Systems do not break quietly, and powerful people do not suddenly lose their footing without a reason. But the television in my tiny apartment told a different story. The morning news playing on low volume while I stood in the kitchen, holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, the anchor's voice steady, almost casual, as she reported that the judge for my case was now under investigation for misconduct, that new evidence had surfaced, that certain financial records were being reviewed. And I remember staring at the screen, my reflection faint in the glass, my heart beating slower, heavier, like it was trying to understand something my mind refused to accept, because this was not how justice worked, not in my world, not for people like me. And yet it kept unfolding, one headline after another, like dominoes falling in a pattern too precise to be coincidence. A witness who had suddenly remembered details that were missing before, a key piece of footage that had been dismissed, now deemed critical, and the man who had walked free just yesterday was no longer invisible. His name everywhere, his confidence replaced with something I could only describe as uncertainty, and I should have felt relief, I should have felt vindicated, but instead there was this quiet, creeping unease, because I knew what I'd seen the night before. I knew the moment something had shifted, and it was not in a courtroom. It was on those steps, in the rain, when a stranger looked at me like my pain was not a question, but a fact. And I tried to tell myself it was unrelated, that this was just the system correcting itself. That maybe sometimes things did work out the way they were supposed to, but the timing was too exact, too immediate, like someone had flipped a switch the moment I walked away, and by the afternoon, it became impossible to ignore his accounts frozen, his business partners distancing themselves, statements released, carefully worded but sharp, enough to cut, and people who had once stood beside him now stepping back like proximity itself had become dangerous. And I found myself sitting on the edge of my bed, phone in my hand, scrolling through updates that felt less like news and more like a controlled collapse, each piece falling exactly where it needed to. And then I saw it, a photo taken outside his office, him being escorted out, not forced, not dragged, just guided. But there was something in his expression, something uncertain, something that had not been there before. And my breath caught because I realized I was not watching justice unfold. I was watching something else entirely, something faster, sharper, more deliberate. And the thought came back, whether I wanted it to or not, his voice calm and quiet. Tell me what they did. And I had said no. I had walked away. I had chosen to believe that whatever he represented was not something I wanted in my life. But standing there in my apartment, the city noise drifting through the window, the weight of everything pressing down on me, I could not ignore the truth anymore. I had asked for justice, and something far more powerful had answered, not with words, not with promises, but with results that felt almost unreal. And for the first time since that courtroom, I did not feel powerless. I felt watched, like somewhere out there, someone had already decided that what happened to me would not be the end of the story. I told myself I would stay out of it, that whatever was happening had nothing to do with me. But that lie lasted less than 24 hours because by the next evening, there was a knock on my door, not loud, not aggressive, just precise, like whoever stood on the other side already knew I would answer. And I remember freezing in place, my hand hovering over the handle, my apartment suddenly feeling too small, too exposed. Every instinct telling me to ignore it, to pretend I was not home. But something deeper, something quieter, pushed me forward. And when I opened the door, there was no one I recognized, just a man in a dark coat standing a few feet back, hands visible, posture calm, the kind of calm that does not come from comfort, but from control. And he did not smile, did not introduce himself. He simply extended a small envelope toward me and said, "Miss Carter, this is for you." His voice neutral, practiced, like this was routine, like delivering messages to strangers was part of his everyday life. And I hesitated, my fingers tightening around the edge of the door because I knew before I even touched it that this was connected, that this was not random, that nothing about the past 2 days had been random. And still I took it because not knowing felt worse than whatever truth waited inside. And the envelope was heavier than I expected. Thick paper, expensive, the kind of detail you notice when you're trying to delay the moment you have to look inside. And when I finally opened it, my breath caught, not because of what I saw, but because of how clear it all was. Documents, copies, records, timelines, everything that had been ignored, dismissed, buried during my case, now laid out in a way that left no room for doubt, no space for interpretation. It was not just proof, it was structure, like someone had taken the chaos of what happened to me and turned it into something undeniable, something impossible to erase. And at the bottom, a single card, black, minimal, with a name I did not recognize, but somehow understood. Adrian Russo, no title, no explanation, just a number. And I stood there in my doorway, the city noise distant, the man who had delivered it already gone without a sound, like he had never been there at all. And my hands were shaking, not from fear, not exactly, but from the weight of realization settling in piece by piece, because this was not help, not in the way I understood help. This was intention, precise and calculated. And it hit me all at once, that moment on the courthouse steps, the way he had looked at me. Not with pity, not with curiosity, but with certainty, like my story had already become his decision. And I had walked away from it, thinking that was the end. But this was only the beginning. And I looked down at the card again, the black surface catching the light just enough to make the name stand out. And for a long second, I did nothing, just stood there, caught between the version of myself that still believed in rules and the part that was starting to understand that rules had never protected me. And when my phone buzzed in my other hand, another news alert, another development, another piece falling into place, I realized something I could not ignore anymore. I was no longer outside of this, whether I wanted to be or not. I had been pulled into it the moment I whispered those words in the rain, and now there was a choice sitting in my palm, quiet, waiting, and for the first time, I was not sure which was more dangerous, walking away again or dialing the number and stepping into whatever world had just rewritten mine. I stared at the card for a long time before I moved, my thumb brushing over the embossed letters like they might disappear if I pressed too hard, like this entire situation would dissolve if I just waited long enough. But the city outside my window did not pause for me. Traffic kept moving, voices carried through the night air, and my phone buzzed again with another alert. Another shift, another piece of a puzzle I never asked to solve. And something inside me snapped, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet break in the part of me that still believed staying still would keep me safe. So I picked up my phone, my fingers, hesitating for half a second before I dialed the number. Each ring stretching longer than it should have, my heartbeat sinking with the sound until the line clicked and silence replaced it, not empty silence, but the kind that feels like someone is already there, listening, and then his voice calm, steady, exactly the same as I remembered. I was wondering how long it would take. No greeting, no question, just certainty, like this moment had been inevitable. And I swallow, my throat dry, trying to find the right words, but realizing there were none. So I said the only thing that felt true, "What did you do?" And there was a pause, not hesitation, just space, like he was deciding how much of the truth I could handle. "I corrected an error," he said, and something in the way he said it made my chest tighten, because he did not sound proud, he did not sound defensive, he sounded precise, like this was not about emotion at all. And I took a step back, leaning against the wall as the weight of everything settled in deeper. "That is not how things work," I said, my voice quieter now, less certain, and I could almost hear the shift on the other end, not in sound, but in presence, like he had moved closer to the idea of me. "It is not how things are supposed to work," he replied, "but you already know that," and I closed my eyes for a second, because he was right, I did know that, I had lived that, felt it, watched it unfold in front of me, while everyone else pretended it was normal. And when I opened my eyes again, the room felt different, smaller somehow, like the world I understood was shrinking to make space for something else, something I did not fully recognize yet. "Why me?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it, because that was the part one could not understand. Out of everyone, out of everything, why did he choose to intervene for me? And this time the pause was longer, heavier, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed, not softer, not warmer, but more direct, like he was no longer speaking to a stranger. "Because you asked," he said, simple, final, and I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it sounded too easy, too clean for something that had already changed so much. "People ask for justice every day," I said, pushing back, needing something more than that, something that made sense, and I could hear it then, the smallest hint of something beneath his control, not emotion exactly, but conviction. "Most people ask the system," he said. "You asked like you already knew it would not answer." And the words settled into me in a way I could not explain, because they were not entirely true. I had not known, not really, but maybe a part of me had, the part that whispered those words in the rain without expecting anyone to hear. And I realized then that this was not just about what he had done, it was about what came next, about the line I was standing on without realizing it. And I tightened my grip on the phone, my voice steadier now, and now what I asked, and this time there was no pause at all, no hesitation, just his answer, immediate and certain. "Now you decide what to do with it." And the line went quiet again, but this time it was different, because the silence was no longer his, it was mine. The line stayed silent after he hung up, but it did not feel empty. It felt like something had been placed in my hands without my permission, something heavy and irreversible, and I stood there for a long time staring at my phone like it might explain what I was supposed to do next, but it did not. It just reflected my own expression back at me, uncertain, caught between two versions of myself that no longer fit together. And eventually I moved, not because I had an answer, but because standing still was starting to feel like a decision on its own. So I walked back to the kitchen, the envelope still open on the counter, the documents spread out in front of me like pieces of a life I barely recognized. And I forced myself to look at them again, really look this time, not just the facts, but the structure, the way everything connected, the timelines, the names, the details that had been dismissed before now, impossible to ignore. And I realized something that made my chest tighten. This was not just about proving what happened to me. This was about control, about knowing exactly where to apply pressure, where to shift attention, where to make the system turn against itself. And I pressed my palms against the counter, grounding myself, because the more I understood it, the less it felt like justice, and the more it felt like something designed, something intentional. And I thought about his voice, the way he said he corrected an error, like it was that simple, like people and lives and consequences could be adjusted with the same precision as numbers on a page. And a part of me wanted to reject it, to hold on to the idea that there was still a right way and a wrong way, that what he did cross a line that should not be crossed. But another part of me, quieter but stronger, kept asking the same question. Where was that line when I needed it? Where was it when everything fell apart and no one stepped in and I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly? Because this was the part no one talks about, the moment when you realize that being right did not protect you, that following the rules did not save you, and now someone had stepped in and changed everything without asking what it would cost. And I did not know if I should be grateful or afraid, and maybe it was both. And my phone buzzed again, another message, not from him, just a notification, another update, another shift in a story that was no longer just mine. And I picked it up, reading the headline, feeling that same strange mix of relief and unease settle deeper into my chest, because every change, every correction, every consequence pointed back to one undeniable truth. This was not stopping, not yet, and I had a choice whether I wanted to be part of it or not. And I looked down at the card again, his name still sharp against the black surface. And for the first time, I understood what he meant. It was not about what he had done, it was about what I would do next. Because once something like this starts, it does not go back to normal, it does not fade quietly into the background. It either pulls you in or leaves you behind. And standing there in my small apartment, surrounded by evidence and silence and the weight of something I could not undo, I realized I was already too far in to pretend this had nothing to do with me anymore. I did not sleep that night. Not really. I lay there staring at the ceiling while the city hummed outside like nothing had changed, but everything had, and I could feel it in the way my thoughts would not settle, in the way every small sound made me turn my head like I was waiting for something else to happen, something bigger, something final. And sometime around 3 a.m, I gave up pretending I could ignore it and sat up, the envelope still on the table across the room, the card still exactly where I left it, like it had been waiting for me to come back and make a decision I was not ready to make. And I told myself I just needed to understand more, that this was about clarity, not involvement. But even as I stood and walked toward it, I knew that was not entirely true, because curiosity is not neutral when it comes to power. It pulls you closer whether you admit it or not. And I picked up the card again, turning it between my fingers, the weight of it unchanged, but my understanding of it shifting with every passing hour. And before I could talk myself out of it, I grabbed my coat, slipped on my shoes, and stepped outside into the early morning air. The streets quieter now, the kind of quiet that feels temporary, like the city is holding its breath before everything starts moving again. I did not have a plan, not really, just a direction, a sense that if I stayed inside, I would keep circling the same thoughts until they consumed me. So I walked past closed storefronts, past streetlights casting long shadows on empty sidewalks, until I reached the one place that still felt real, the courthouse steps, the same place where everything shifted, where I thought the story had ended and did not realize it was only beginning. And I stood there again, in the same spot, the memory of the rain still sharp in my mind, even though the sky above me was clear now, pale with the first hint of sunrise. And I tried to see it differently, tried to understand what he saw when he looked at me that night, what made him decide that my story was worth rewriting. And the more I thought about it, the less it felt like a choice, and the more it felt like something inevitable, like he had not stepped in because he wanted to, but because in his world, things like this did not go unanswered. And that realization should have made me feel safer, should have made me feel protected. But instead it made me feel exposed. Because if someone like him could decide to intervene without hesitation, then what else could he decide? What else could he change? And I exhaled slowly, my breath visible in the cool air, my fingers tightening around the card as I looked down at it again. And for the first time, I did not just see a name, I saw a door, one that had already opened whether I walked through it or not. and my phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me back. Another notification, another update, but I did not check it right away. I just stood there, letting the moment stretch, because I understood now that whatever I chose next would not just affect me. It would define the kind of world I was willing to accept. And when I finally pulled the phone out and looked at the screen, the headline confirmed what I already felt. This was not slowing down. The system was not correcting itself. It was being corrected piece by someone who did not wait for permission. And I closed my eyes for a second, steadying myself, because there was no going back to before, not anymore. And when I opened them again, my gaze settled on the city in front of me, familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. And I realized something that settled deep in my chest like a quiet truth. I'd spent my whole life believing the law was something you followed, but now I was standing at the edge of something else entirely, something that did not follow anything, something that made its own rules, and whether I liked it or not, I was already standing close enough to feel its pull. I did not notice the car at first because it blended into everything else. Just another dark vehicle parked along the curb, engine running low, windows tinted enough to reflect the pale morning light, instead of revealing anything inside. And I might have walked right past it if the door had not opened at the exact moment I stepped off the last courthouse step. The sound soft but deliberate, like timing mattered, like everything about this moment had been calculated down to the second. And I stopped without meaning to, my body reacting before my mind could catch up, because I knew, before I even looked, I knew who it was. And when I turned, he was already stepping out, the same composed presence, the same stillness in the way he moved, like the world adjusted itself around him instead of the other way around. And for a second, neither of us spoke, the space between us filled with everything that had already happened, everything that had changed since the last time we stood face to face. And I realized then that I had been expecting this, maybe not consciously, but somewhere deeper, I knew this was not over, not yet. And he looked at me the same way he had that night, not surprised, not curious, just certain, like I had followed a path he already mapped out. And I felt something tighten in my chest, not fear exactly, but awareness, sharp and unavoidable, because this time I was not the same person standing in the rain. This time I understood what he was capable of, what he had already done, and that made everything different. You came back, he said, his voice calm, almost quiet against the morning air, and I almost corrected him. Almost said that I had not come back for him, that I was just trying to understand, but the words felt weak before I even formed them, so I just nodded once, my grip tightening slightly around the card still in my hand, and his eyes flicked to it briefly, acknowledging it without comment, like it was simply part of the equation, and I took a step closer before I could second-guess it, the distance between us narrowing in a way that made everything feel more real, more immediate. You changed everything, I said, not accusing, not grateful, just stating what had become undeniable, and he held my gaze, steady, unshaken. I adjusted what was already broken, he replied, and there was again that same precision, that same refusal to frame it as anything emotional, and I exhaled slowly because that answer was not enough. Not anymore. That is not your decision to make, I said, my voice firmer now, grounded in something I was still trying to hold on to, and for the first time, something shifted in his expression, not a reaction, not surprise, just a slight narrowing of focus, like he was seeing me more clearly now, not as a situation, but as a person pushing back against him. And he stepped closer, not invading, not forcing, just enough to close the space in, a way that made his presence impossible to ignore. It became my decision the moment no one else made it, he said, and the words landed heavier than anything else he had said so far, because I could not argue with them. Not completely, not honestly, and silence stretched between us again. But this time it was different, charged with something unspoken, something waiting, and I realized that this was the moment everything balanced on. Not what he had done, not what had already changed, but what I would accept moving forward, and my heart was steady now. Not racing, not uncertain, just present, because for the first time since all of this started, I was not reacting, I was choosing, and I lifted my chin slightly, meeting his gaze without looking away. And what happens if I do not agree with how you fix things? I asked, and this time there was no pause, no calculation, just his answer, immediate and absolute. Then I show you why I do. His words did not sound like a threat, and that was what unsettled me the most, because there was no force behind them, No raised voice, no urgency, just quiet certainty, like whatever he believed did not need to be defended. And I felt it in the way the air shifted between us. Not heavier, not lighter, just different, like I had stepped into something I could not fully see yet. And for a second, I considered walking away again. Choosing distance, choosing the version of myself that still believed I could separate my life from his world. But that version felt smaller now, less real, like something I'd already outgrown without realizing it. And I exhaled slowly, steadying myself before I spoke. Then show me, the words leaving my mouth before I could overthink them. And something in his expression changed, not visibly, not in a way anyone else would notice, but I felt it like a line had been crossed, like I had just given him permission without fully understanding what that meant. And he nodded one subtle control before stepping back and gesturing toward the car. The same black vehicle, the same quiet presence waiting at the curb like it had never left, and I hesitated for half a second, just enough to acknowledge the weight of the decision. Before I moved, my steps measured as I approached, the door already open, the interior dim and composed, nothing excessive, nothing obvious, just clean lines and quiet control. And when I sat down, the door closed behind me with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have, like a boundary sealing itself. And he took the seat beside me, not too close, not distant, just there, his presence filling the space without needing to dominate it. And the car began to move almost immediately, smooth, seamless, like it had been waiting for this exact moment. And I watched the city pass by through the window, familiar streets shifting into something else, something I was seeing differently now. Every building, every corner, every reflection carrying a new layer I had never noticed before. And for a while, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us, but not uncomfortable, just intentional, like this was part of it, part of whatever he was about to show me. And I found myself paying attention to small things, the rhythm of the car, the way he sat still but alert, the way everything about him felt control without being forced. And eventually, I turned my head slightly, my voice quieter now, but steady. "Where are we going?" And he did not look at me when he answered, his gaze fixed ahead to the part you did not see. And that answer settled into me in a way that made my chest tighten, because I knew exactly what he meant. There was always more behind every decision, every outcome, every moment that looked simple on the surface, but was anything but underneath. And the car slowed as we turned onto a quieter street. The noise of the city fading just enough to make everything feel more focused, more contained, and I felt it again, that awareness sharper now, not fear, not hesitation, just clarity, because this was no longer about what had already happened. This was about understanding the cost, the process, the reality of what it meant when someone decided to step outside the system and reshape it instead of working within it. And when the car finally came to a stop, I did not move right away, my hand resting lightly against the door. My reflection faint in the glass as I looked at it, seeing something in my own expression that had not been there before, something steadier, something more certain. And I realized then that whatever waited outside that door was not just his world, it was something I'd already stepped into the moment I chose to stay. And when I finally opened it and stepped out, the air felt different. Not because the city had changed, but because I had. And behind me, his voice came, calm, measured, like everything else about him. This is where truth stops asking for permission. And I did not turn around, not yet, because for the first time, I was not sure if I was ready to see just how far that truth could go. I stepped forward slowly, my shoes quiet against the pavement, the street around me unusually still for this part of the city, like everything here operated on a different rhythm. One that did not rush or hesitate, but simply existed with purpose. And when I finally lifted my gaze, I saw the building in front of me, not flashy, not marked, just clean glass and steel rising into the morning light. The kind of place you would walk past without a second thought. And yet something about it felt deliberate, like it was designed not to be noticed, and that alone made it impossible to ignore. And I heard the car door close behind me, followed by his footsteps, measured, unhurried, stopping just close enough to remind me I was not here alone. And I did not turn right away. I kept looking at the building, trying to understand what I was supposed to see, what he wanted me to notice, because there was nothing obvious, no signs, no guards, nothing that suggested this place held anything different from the rest of the city. And that was when it clicked. The absence itself was the difference. The control was so completed. Did not need to announce itself. And I felt something shift inside me again. That same quiet realization that had been building since the moment I picked up that card. And I spoke without looking back, my voice steady. This is not about justice anymore, is it? And for a second, there was no answer, just the faint sound of the city waking up around us, distant traffic, a door closing somewhere down the block. And then his voice, calm as always, it never was. And I closed my eyes briefly, letting that settle, because part of me had already known. I just needed to hear it out loud, needed it to be undeniable. And when I opened my eyes again, I turned to face him, really look at him this time, not as the man who had helped me, not as the one who had changed everything, but as the person standing behind all. And there was nothing exaggerated about him, no visible edge, no obvious warning, just control, precise and absolute. And that made it harder, not easier, because there was nothing to push against, nothing to label as wrong in a simple way. And I took a breath, grounding myself in the only thing I still knew for sure. Then what is it? I asked, and his gaze held mine steady, unflinching. It is balance, he said, and the word felt heavier than it should have, because balance implied fairness, but nothing about this felt fair in the way I understood it. It felt constructed, chosen, shaped by someone who decided what mattered and what did not. And I shook my head, slightly, not in refusal, but in disbelief. You decide what that looks like, I said, and it was not a question, it was a realization. And he did not deny it, did not soften it, just met it with the same quiet certainty. Someone has to, he replied. And there was again that line, that divide between the world I thought I lived in and the one I was standing in now. And I felt the weight of it settle deeper, not crushing, but present, like something I could not ignore anymore. And I looked back at the building, the glass reflecting the sky in a way that made it impossible to see inside. And I understood then that this was not a place meant to be seen. It was a place meant to operate, to exist beyond the surface, just like everything he had done so far. And my fingers tightened slightly at my sides as I stepped forward again, closing the distance to the entrance, not because I was ready, but because I was no longer willing to stand outside and pretend I was not already part of this. And as I reached for the door, I felt his presence behind me, not pushing, not guiding, just there, constant. And his voice followed, low and certain. What you see next will not change what happened, he said. And I paused for half a second, my hand resting against the cool surface of the glass, because I knew what he meant. This was not about the past. It was about understanding the future. And I pushed the door open anyway, because some part of me needed to know how far this really went. The moment I stepped inside, the noise of the city disappeared like someone had closed the door on it, replaced by a silence that did not feel empty, but controlled, deliberate, the kind of silence that exists when everything inside it is already known. And I paused just past the entrance, my eyes adjusting to the softer light, taking in the space around me. The clean lines, the absence of clutter, nothing unnecessary, everything placed with intention, and it felt less like an office and more like a system, something that functioned without needing to announce itself. And I became aware of movement without sound, people passing through the space with quiet efficiency, no rushed steps, no wasted gestures, each of them focused, precise, like they understood exactly where they needed to be and why. And none of them looked surprised to see him. None of them questioned his presence. They simply acknowledged it in subtle ways, a glance, a shift in posture, like gravity itself had entered the room. And I felt it then, not fear, not intimidation, but clarity, sharp and undeniable. This was not chaos. This was structure, just not the kind I'd been taught to trust. And I took another step forward, my voice lower now, more thoughtful than defensive. This is how you do it. And it was not really a question, more of an observation forming as I saw it unfold around me. And he moved beside me, not leading, not following, just aligning his pace with mine. This is how it gets done. He corrected, and I felt the difference in those words, because doing something and getting it done were not the same. One followed rules, the other ensured outcomes, and I exhaled slowly, my gaze shifting from one detail to another, trying to understand the scale of it, because this was bigger than I expected. Not just influence, not just access, but coordination, a network of decisions happening in real time, and I realized that everything I'd seen on the outside, every headline, every sudden shift, it had all started here in a place like this where nothing was accidental and nothing was left to chance. And we stopped near a glass wall overlooking another room, and I hesitated before looking in, not because I was afraid of what I would see, but because I knew it would confirm something I was not sure I was ready to accept. And when I finally did, it was not what I expected. No raised voices, no visible tension, just people working focused, calm, screens filled with information, conversations happening in low tones, everything moving forward with quiet certainty. And that was what unsettled me the most, because there was no chaos to reject, no obvious line being crossed, just a system operating under a different set of rules. And I turned to him again, searching his expression for something that would make this simpler, something I could label, something I could push against. But there was nothing there except that same steady presence, that same unshaken control, and I felt something shift inside me again, not breaking this time, but rearranging like pieces of a perspective I had held for years were being placed into a new pattern. And I spoke carefully, choosing my words with more awareness than before. And you think this is better? And it was not a challenge, not entirely, just a question that mattered more than anything else. Right now. And he did not answer immediately, his gaze moving across the room, taking the same details I was seeing, but understanding them in a way I was only beginning to grasp. "I think this is honest," he said finally, and the word stayed with me, heavier than I expected, because honesty was not something I associated with power like this, not in the world I knew. And yet standing here, watching everything move with purpose, I could not deny that nothing was being hidden, not from him, not from the people inside this space. And that realization settled deeper than anything else had so far, because it meant this was not about pretending to be right. It was about deciding what right looked like and acting on it without hesitation. And I looked back through the glass one more time, my reflection, faint against the surface, blending with everything behind it. And I realized that the question I had been asking since the beginning was starting to change. It was no longer about whether what he did was right or wrong. It was about whether I could accept a world where right was not defined by rules, but by the people willing to enforce it. I stayed there longer than I expected, staring through the glass like if I looked hard enough, I could find a flaw, something obvious, something I could point to and say this is where it breaks, this is where it becomes wrong. But everything kept moving with that same quiet precision, and the longer I watched, the more I understood that the absence of chaos was not accidental. It was controlled, designed, and that realization unsettled me in a way I could not easily explain, because I had always believed that power left traces, that it revealed itself in excess or imbalance. But this felt different. This felt refined, like something that had evolved past the need to prove itself. And I became aware of him again beside me, not speaking, not interrupting, just allowing me to process it in my own time, which somehow made it harder, because there was no pressure to push against, no force to resist, just space to think. And I turned away from the glass, slowly, my reflection disappearing as I faced him again, my thoughts no longer scattered but not settled either. "We're not just fixing things," I said, my voice quieter but clearer now. "You are deciding what deserves to be fixed." And it felt important to say it out loud, to acknowledge the shift in understanding. And he met my gaze without hesitation, without denial, just that same steady presence that had been constant from the beginning. "Everything cannot be fixed," he replied, and the simplicity of it made something in my chest tighten, because I knew he was right, not in theory, but in reality, in the world I had lived in, where some things were ignored, dismissed, buried, and I had accepted that once without realizing it. And I took a slow breath, grounding myself again, because this was where the line blurred, where right and wrong stopped being clear and started becoming choices. And I felt the weight of that settle deeper, not overwhelming, but undeniable. And I asked the question that had been building since I stepped inside, the one that mattered more than anything else now. And what happens when you are wrong? And this time, there was a pause, not long, not uncertain, but present, like the question itself carried weight. And he looked at me differently for a moment, not evaluating, not measuring, just seeing. And when he answered, his voice did not change. but something in it felt more direct, more personal than I carry it, he said, and the words landed heavier than anything else he had said so far, because they were not defensive, not dismissive. They were accepting, like he had already considered that possibility and made peace with it. And I felt something shift again, not an agreement, not an acceptance, but an understanding, because that was the part one had not expected, not the power, not the control, but the willingness to take responsibility for it without hiding behind anything else. And I looked at him for a long second, really looked this time, not at what he represented, not at what he had done, but at the person standing in front of me. And I realized that whatever this was, whatever world he operated in, it was not built on the absence of consequence. It was built on choosing to accept them. And that made it more dangerous, not less, because it meant there was no illusion of safety, no false promise of fairness, just decisions and outcomes and the willingness to stand behind them. And I turned slightly, my gaze drifting back toward the glass, toward the system that continued to move without hesitation. And I felt the question forming again, not about him this time, but about me, about where I stood in all of this, about whether I could exist in a space like this without losing something I was not sure I could get back. And I spoke again, softer now, more to myself than to him. This changes everything. And I did not mean just what had happened to me. I meant the way I saw the world, the way I understood control, justice, consequence, all of it shifting into something less certain, but more real. And he did not respond right away. He did not need to, because the truth was already there. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, unchanged, but the meaning settled deeper than before. It already has, and I knew then that there was no going back to the person I was before I stepped through that door. I did not move right away after he said that, because something in me needed time to catch up, not to what he had done, not even to what I had seen, but to what it meant for me. And I stood there in that quiet space, surrounded by a system that did not hesitate, did not question itself, and I felt the difference between that and everything I had known before, the way I used to wait, to hope, to believe that if I followed the right steps, something would eventually shift in my favor. And now I was standing inside something that did not wait for permission to act, and the contrast was no longer theoretical. It was real, it was here, and it was asking something from me, whether I wanted to admit it or not. And I turned slowly, my gaze moving away from the glass, away from the movement behind it, focusing instead on the space around us, the details I had missed when I first walked in, the way nothing here was accidental, the way everything existed with purpose. And I realized that this place was not just about control. It was about consistency, about ensuring that once a decision was made, it carried through without hesitation, without interference. And that was something the system I had trusted had never given me. And I felt that realization settle deeper, not sharp this time, not overwhelming, just steady, like something that had been forming for a long time, finally finding its shape. And I looked at him again, not searching for answers this time, but measuring something else entirely, something quieter, more personal. You do not wait for things to be fair, I said, my voice calm now, grounded in understanding rather than resistance. And he did not correct me, did not soften it, just acknowledged it with the same quiet certainty. And I nodded slightly, because that was the truth of it. Fairness was not part of this, not in the way I had defined it. And yet, standing here, I could not deny that what he created had its own kind of order, its own kind of logic. And I took a slow breath, letting that settle, because this was the moment I had been approaching since the beginning. Not when I asked for justice, not when he answered, but now, when I had to decide what that answer meant to me. And I felt the weight of that choice clearly, not forced, not rushed, just present. And I spoke again, more carefully this time, each word chosen with intention. If I walk away now, I said, does any of this stop? And it was not fear that drove the question. It was clarity, because I needed to understand whether my involvement mattered or if this would continue regardless of what I chose. And he met my gaze without hesitation, his answer immediate, no. And that single word settled everything in a way nothing else could, because it removed the illusion that this depended on me, that this was something I could control by stepping back. And I felt something shift inside me again, not breaking, not resisting, but aligning. Because if this was going to exist with or without me, then the only real question left was whether I would remain outside of it or step into it with my eyes open. And I looked down briefly, my hands steady now, no longer shaking the way they had when this first began, and I realized that the fear I expected to feel was not there, not in the way I thought it would be, because understanding changes things. It does not make them safer, but it makes them clearer. And I lifted my gaze again, meeting his eyes without hesitation, because for the first time, I was not reacting to what he had done. I was responding to what I now understood, and that difference mattered more than anything else. And I said it quietly, not as a declaration, not as a surrender, but as a truth I could no longer ignore. Then I need to know how it works, and the moment the words left my mouth, I felt it, that shift, subtle but undeniable, like I had just crossed something that did not exist a few days ago. And he held my gaze for a second longer, not surprised, not satisfied, just certain, like this had always been where the path was leading. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, unchanged, but the meaning settled deeper than before. Then you will learn. And for the first time since all of this began, I did not feel like something was happening to me. I felt like I had stepped into it willingly, and that made all the difference. It did not feel like a dramatic moment. There was no sudden shift in the room, no visible change in the way things moved around us. But something inside me settled into place with a clarity I had not felt before, and I stood there, no longer at the edge of something unfamiliar, but within it, aware, present, and choosing to stay. And he nodded once, not as approval, not as acknowledgement, but as confirmation, like a step in a process that had already begun. And he turned slightly, gesturing for me to follow, not with urgency, not with command, just expectation. And this time, I did not hesitate. I moved with him, my step steady, my thoughts no longer scattered but aligned, because for the first time since everything started, I was not trying to make sense of it from the outside. I was beginning to understand it from within. And as we walked deeper into the building, the space shifted again, not visually, but in feeling more focused, more deliberate, like every layer we passed through brought us closer to something central, something that did not need to be explained because it simply existed as the core of everything around it. And I realized that this was not about replacing the world I knew. It was about revealing the one that had always been there beneath it, the one that operated when the other failed. And I thought back to that night in the rain, to the version of myself who stood there believing that justice was something you asked for and waited to receive. And I almost did not recognize her anymore, not because she was wrong, but because she did not yet understand what happened when no one answered. And now I did. Now I understood that silence is not empty. It is space waiting for someone to decide what comes next. And I had stepped into that space without realizing it. And now there was no stepping back, only forward, and we stopped in front of another glass door. This one different, not because of how it looked, but because of how it felt. Like crossing it meant accepting something fully, not partially, not with hesitation. And I paused for just a second, not out of doubt, but out of awareness, because I knew this was the moment that defined everything that came after. And I turned my head slightly, just enough to meet his gaze again, and there was no question left in me. No uncertainty, just understanding, and he did not need to say anything because the answer was already there. And I pushed the door open, stepping through without looking back, because whatever I was before this, whatever I believed before this, it no longer fit the world I was now part of. And as the door closed behind me, soft and final, I realized something that stayed with me long after that moment passed. He did not give me justice. He showed me what existed when justice failed. And more importantly, he gave me a choice to see it clearly or turn away. And I chose to see. And maybe that is what this story really is. Not about power, not about control, but about the moment you realize that waiting for things to be right is not the same as making them right. And the truth is, not everyone will have someone step in and change the outcome for them. Not everyone will be given a second chance to understand how the world really works. But everyone has a moment, a quiet moment, where they decide whether they will stay silent or step forward, whether they will accept what is given or question it. And if there is anything to take from this, it is that your voice matters, even when it feels small, even when it feels like no one is listening, because sometimes the most important shift does not come from being heard by the system. It comes from refusing to disappear within it. So stand your ground, ask your questions, demand better, not just for yourself, but for the world you are part of, because change does not begin when everything is fair. It begins the moment someone decides it should be.